What's your minimum specification?
So hi everyone, you join me at a very interesting time, interesting place. We are here at Intel's Overclocking Lab. Why does Intel need an overclocking lab, you might ask? Doesn't the chip only do plus 100 megahertz? I'm here with someone who tells you you can push it harder than you ever thought possible. Why? Because he's the guy that actually decides what knobs users can end up twiddling with. His name is Dan Ragland. He's been at Intel for 24 years, and he's the head of the OC lab. And let me introduce you to Dan. What is your official title? Do you have one?
Yeah. I'm Overclocking Engineering lead in the CCG PC group.
And what is CCG and CCP?
Yes, it's our client computing group. So we're working on desktop and mobile products.
You mean we're not going to see an overclockable Xeon in the future?
Well, I'm not talking about unreleased product today, but...
that is a very Intel answer, I'll give you that. So you've been at Intel for 24 years. You didn't start at the OC lab because that really wasn't a thing back then. So describe your journey through Intel, if you would.
Yeah, great. I started when I was 20 years old as a contractor, actually. And I was going to do a 6-month job at Intel, working on the motherboards that Intel produced at the time, Intel branded motherboards. And that went well, and I was like, this is a lot of fun. Let me slow down my completion of college. And I was able to join as a technician back in 1998. And so worked on motherboards for a number of years, later on finishing my degree and working in technical marketing for motherboards for a couple of years. And then went on to take on a role to start what we called the Mobile Halo, which is our first ever mobile overclockable parts and our gaming lineup that we have today. And then switched, and throughout this whole time, overclocking was kind of a side project, which we can talk about if you want. But then after that mobile role for 7 years, I came back to desktop, and I was blessed with being able to actually start this team that we have here in this form this lab space.
So when did the OC lab really start as being a fundamental aspect of Intel's product line? I mean, I know you mentioned the Halo mobile parts, but when did it really take off from being like, say, a 1-2 person side thing into being big? And beyond that, does the OC lab have an overarching mission?
Yes. So first part of your question, people have worked on overclocking. It's really been a passion project for a lot of people. So I don't want to discount the number of employees over the years that just contributed organically to overclocking. And there were a lot. But as a formal lab here, around 2014-15 is when we formed the team, started growing it from there. And and I guess our mission is to provide an amazing experience to people who are interested in tuning the performance or overclocking their processor. So we want to give them controls, capabilities, everything possible to make that a good experience.
One of the questions I get every now and again is, Intel sells you a chip, say a K-SKU, overclockable, but overclocking voids the warranty, right? Why would Intel offer a feature that arguably avoids the warranty on the product that they're selling to end users? How do you marry that with having an overclocking presence lab here at Intel? Yeah,
that's a great question. So, Intel, big company, top producer of processors worldwide. We want to be rock solid, stable, reliable. We want everyone to know they can expect that from us. So when it comes to overclocking, we do want to distinguish that there are separate risks that come there. So you can buy a rock solid products, or you can buy an overclockable part and choose to opt in to overclock that. And we do want to be really upfront that there are some risks that come with that. Now, gathering the number of people that overclock and the amount of overclocking out there, I think there's plenty of people who are willing to that want to take that risk and push performance to that next level. So that's really where we're focused on the overclocking side.
How much experience did you have of overclocking before the OC lab got into, where it is when you kind of came into it? Because I mean, I've said on my channel before, my background is some extreme overclocking, being in the overclocking leagues. You obviously can't do that because you're an employee of of Intel. So
Yeah, so my background in overclocking has never been more on the extreme world record setting as a person, my personal role in overclocking. It's always been, hey, I'm buying Intel's best product, and truly before I worked at Intel, and I want to push that best and make it better. So as a high school kid, I worked for a small computer shop. We built clone machines. So I learned in those early days about, hey, you bought that 33 megahertz processor, but you can push it to 50 megahertz, right, with a jumper setting or a crystal swap out. And that's kind of where I got into it. And then, joining Intel, inside Intel, we're always tuning knobs and adjusting things. And we had controls of the ratio. And at one point, something called remarking was going on in the market, and it was not a good thing. Products, third parties would kind of modify the label on the processor essentially, and indicate that it was, say, that 50 megahertz instead of 33 that it was. And we needed a way to prevent that, so that again, rock solid, stable, reliable, people could count on us. So we locked the ratio, and at that point, for non, before K-SKU existed. And so the only form of overclocking you would have would be B-clock overclocking. It was at that point that a group of essentially passion project volunteers inside of Intel started discussing, hey, how could we keep things rock solid and stable, but allow people to overclock? And that's where, K-SKU was born. I was an Extreme Edition, ahead of that. Yeah. So Extreme Edition, then K-SKU. And I got to be there as kind of the junior guy as the Extreme Edition was being formed. And so I was part of overclocking via the Intel motherboards at the time for that project. And then I was more on the mobile side when K-SKU was created. So my predecessor was working on that with marketing and came up with the K-SKU strategy. And then I rejoined shortly thereafter and kind of have been taking it from there.
So at what stage does the OC Lab get involved in next generation overclocking, defining next generation features? Is it pre-silicon, that the idea of, that scale out? Or are we talking when the silicon's essentially baked and you're just deciding how to optimize it further?
Yeah, so we get involved very early. Ballpark year-wise, about 5 years before a product comes to market, we're involved. So we're in the early planning stages. So all the different features that are discussed for a new processor, we're in there. We have overclocking line items. We call it the overclocking domain. And we make sure that new subsystems that we need to be aware of, new opportunities that we're developing overclocking requirements to make sure we're covered. Yeah, you can't put overclocking on cruise control and just say, hey, you've got the multiplier, you got voltage, you're done. It requires continual cultivation to keep it moving forward.
So if you're involved 3 to 5 years out, and I was to mention Meteor Lake, Lunar Lake, or those names that we may have heard of, am I getting the right sense of timescale there? I mean, I'm not asking you to announce what you're working on, but are we talking, that's the sort of timescale we're looking at.
The overclocking team is involved in projects that you didn't even name.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Which brings me on to my next question. Are you solely involved on the CPU side? Intel has a wide array of products, some of which are overclockable. So we're in touch with our counterparts in other parts of the company, including the graphics world. We act as one Intel. We share back and forth. But at this stage, we're operating kind of in parallel, but together. Okay. I have seen a few people say, well, is Intel going to call the overclockable graphics K-SKUs as well? I know you're not going to say anything about that, but it'd be interesting to see what naming comes out with the overclockable graphics SKUs, right?
Yeah.
So at some level, overclocking could be considered the same as binning hardware, right? I think before we started talking, we were talking about the gradations in the variability of the silicon. So to what level do you guys get involved in deciding what bins are correct for retail versus what the headroom for overclocking is, right? We see a lot of people saying, well, Intel CPUs no longer have any headroom because they're bins to the max. That's been a feature of recent generations. Do you have much to say on that?
Well, I would say that our number one priority is to deliver that out-of-the-box performance the best we possibly can to consumers. And a rule of thumb is we do not withhold performance to leave it for overclocking headroom. So if we do find a performance opportunity to have a SKU that gives you that best gaming experience, creation experience, we're going to do that and not hold it back for overclocking. So then our job would be as overclocking team to find that headroom. I say leave no stone unturned. We look at every subsystem, every area, and find every last ounce of performance within those defined SKUs.
So I mean, to put you on a spot for the second, when Alder Lake just launched and we have the 12900K, I remember in the presentations you saying that the one-click overclocking allows plus 100 megahertz on the cores, plus 300 megahertz on the efficiency cores. Would you consider that performance left on the table for the productization of that SKU? Or was that kind of performance you found after? Or was that just...
Yeah, good question. So performance comes in many areas. So when you're defining a product, you tend to have a power threshold, including current and thermals. You have what voltage do you need to run at those frequencies. So those are some of the things that kind of define that in-spec performance. So in that example you gave, that is indeed overclocking headroom. You'll see that on a very large distribution of parts that could achieve that. But no, it was not left on the table.
Have you ever overclocked hardware that didn't make it to market?
Yeah. Yep. We love to experiment. So, I mean, yeah, you name it, we've tried to overclock it and different product categories, We talk about notebooks and desktops, and, there have been other things we've looked at overclocking.
So when one of the Intel engineers came to, I think it was Mobile World Congress with a 65-core smartphone chip. But, are we talking that level, or are we talking, projects that got canned, or just variations of?
Yeah, I don't mean to imply that we've checked out everything that Intel's ever done, but when a new product category comes to light, you look at it and you say, is there headroom, and is there a market? Would consumers want this, and would there be a value to it? So, I'll give you one example. I did some pioneering work on SSD overclocking. Oh, and wow. Actually, there is a lot of headroom to be had, at least when we looked at this, in SSD overclocking, because like a CPU, they have their own power limits. Yep. And depending on, can you cool it? What environment are you in? There is headroom to be had there. But we evaluated that and said, okay, is your data at risk, right? So, we kind of surveyed the market and ultimately made the decision to not, pursue that in earnest. It's something, we'll always keep our mind open, but at the time that was the decision.
So on the flip side, have you ever been tasked with overclocking something that you personally have thought, why would I ever want to overclock this?
Yeah, I guess, I think sometimes I don't think that initially. I'm like, hey, you know what? Any opportunity to overclock something new, let's check it out. And then as you get into it and you look at some of the trade-offs, you might, realize that maybe the scope is very narrow for who would benefit from that. I hate to close any door on anyone, though, even if it is a narrow opportunity. But yeah, those things might happen. I might later, think, maybe that's not the right direction.
So you can help me overclock my RGB LEDs. Okay, noted. Should we bundle the term underclocking in with overclocking? I mean, you guys, Overclocking Lab, right? Underclocking is still arguably a bigger portion of people are more interested in underclocking, making sure their processor is more efficient for small form factor or for server installations. Do you do much on that front?
I guess if you call that kind of performance tuning or performance optimization, we're kind of under that same umbrella. And we do have, as part of our overclocking toolkit, the ability to undervolt or reduce the voltage. So yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Performance tuning lab doesn't have the same ring.
Exactly.
Exactly. Right. So back in the day, Intel used to organize extreme overclocking events. I mean, we're sitting here with liquid nitrogen behind us, and you've shown me chiller lines running through your lab, just for consistent performance. Are there any plans in the future to do extreme overclocking type events?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing I can commit to right now, but yes, we're actually actively involved in the community, sponsoring places like HardwareBot. Yep. Trying to do our part to keep the community healthy and invigorated and attract new people to the market. people who grew up with overclocking, it might have been more organic and natural, but creating opportunities. We're involved actually locally here with the university. So Oregon State University has an overclocking club, and
Oh, wow.
we've actually hosted them here a number of times and support them with some sample units to do their testing, so that they get that experience.
Jeff's nodding his head, so I assume you were there.
I'm aware.
You're aware.
Yeah, Dr.
That's
Guess
perfect.
over there. Yeah.
So I've noticed that with some of Intel's product launches, you prefer to get external overclockers on the camera to do their work rather than, say, members of the team. No doubt your team has a big hand in helping that, but is that just because those people are known in the community and have notoriety, and perhaps the guys here don't necessarily want to be in front of the camera? And
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because we feel strongly that it's our job to create something for people to overclock themselves. It would be almost unfair for Intel to send an overclocking team in and just smash all the records and then say, all right, it's launched, go, good luck. You kind of steal that joy if you do that. So
Right.
we do want to always work with the external ecosystem. We want things to be attainable by overclockers, both for the everyday overclocker and for those extreme overclockers.
is that because arguably you have more control over the tuning that you can do internally versus what people can do externally?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it would be unfair for us to compete.
So
The kind of things that we could do here. We can have essentially a spinal tap to the processor and have more knobs than you could ever imagine. And that really would be undetectable. So it would simply be unfair for us to compete.
So given that the world CPU frequency record is something like 8828 megahertz, are you saying that you may have gone beyond that internally?
Well, I'll say this. We could have produced screenshots and validations at very, very high frequencies on 12th gen.
Yeah.
We did not.
So, I mean, in the past, both you and your competitors have had unique processors that you seed to 100, 120 people. I believe Intel, back in the day, used to call them Black Ops. AMD had their, TWKRs back in the Phenom 2 days. Is that still something that there's interest in doing on that side?
As far as seeding samples to extreme overclockers?
As in having that sort of like unique SKU that might have more of the tuning available?
Well, that sounds like fun, but I'm not allowed to discuss potential future products.
So in the overclocking community, there are stories of how individuals will buy 500 units to find that one cherry that's great for all their overclocking and their benchmarks and their results, trying to get world number one. With what you guys do here, can you put that 500 number into context? I assume you guys go through more than 500 sometimes.
Yeah, we have. Generally, it doesn't take that many to get a statistically significant number of units if you know the overall distribution. So, whereas
of course, you have more data than everybody else, so you know what is a cherry sample, I guess.
Exactly, and so we can pick, the highs, the lows, the in-betweens, and test and with a smaller number of units and get that same information. But we're still talking about, it's not uncommon to test 50 to 100 units, but generally not 500 plus.
Okay. So how much of your day-to-day is ensuring that the ones on the low end of that distribution are still worthwhile for end users?
We definitely factor that in. So we want to, for example, with that feature Intel Speed Optimizer, part of the Extreme Tuning utility, we have to create a path that works for those lesser units and those extreme units.
How often do you take competitors' products and overclock them in sort of like a competitive analysis type situation?
We like to stay aware of the competitive environment, but beyond that, I'm not able to comment. Sorry.
I mean, for context, I can imagine you guys taking, say, like an Apple M1 and finding ways in which you can tweak that, finding out how locked down it is. Would that be? I'm not saying specifically the M1, but that sort of thing would be done here.
I would just say that we believe it's important to understand the competitive landscape and where our opportunities to grow are and where our strengths are. And so we do keep a keen eye out for those. And we take it seriously. I mean, our team, we want to win. We want to be number one. And so, we leave no stone unturned, whether it's internal or beyond, looking at what the opportunities are.
Marketing has trained you well. That's a very good answer. So, what's the most underrated or obscure overclocking feature that people need to talk more about? Everybody knows voltage, frequency means increased thermals, but...
I'll give you two real quick. The first one is per-core overclocking. People are starting to develop awareness about that. That's been out for probably 4 years now, and more attention probably should be paid there. And I think it's thanks to the community, we're seeing a little more attention there. So per-core overclocking, really important. There's a big diversity in the capability of each core, as I'm sure you're well aware. We have features, like Turbo Boost Max 3.0, aka favorite core, that kind of highlight that. So that's one. And the second one is something newer. We call it overclocking thermal velocity boost. And in hindsight, we probably should have given it a different name because it's similar to thermal velocity boost, but it's very different. It's basically the user can define the frequency you will achieve at various temperature points. Okay. And the principle there is cold silicon can achieve higher frequencies and do so at a lower voltage. And so that's the application there. And that's really only been around for a couple of years now, and I think that's one folks should look at.
Right now, Intel's consumer line up to 125 watts base power, 250 turbo boost power. Intel hasn't done a high-end desktop part in a few generations, and we're seeing other CPUs in the market do 280 watt, 350 watt. Is there a point where perhaps Intel says, here's a CPU, you can overclock it, but you have to have liquid cooling? Do you think you'd ever put that restriction on the market there?
I wouldn't rule anything out, and
right.
I think the market could handle something like that. But beyond that, I wouldn't be able to comment.
So, how overclocked is your system at home?
It is overclocked probably.
What do you
say
have?
20%.
What?
So a couple. So okay. So I have a Alder Lake, which is our 10th gen.
Yep.
And I still run the old X99.
Yep.
So the Haswell E generation. That one I have overclocked about 25%. It has its own purpose, but I had been reusing it for this. This is kind of funny. Some workloads scale linearly with frequency, as you know. And, my daughter has DVDs, and we want to put those on a tablet for viewing on a road trip. So that job of the conversion job scales linearly with frequency. So when I overclock by 25%, roughly the job gets done 25% faster. So when I'm going through that stack of disks, that was a great application I had there. In the early days, I was more into that gaming scheme, and I still love catering to gamers. It's like, once somebody is a quarterback in the major, in football, they're going to always have a love for that sport. So I'll always love gaming and overclocking to tune for gaming. But these days, my focus is more on creation.
So I think we kind of skipped over this earlier, but should Intel label its overclocking GPUs with the letter K? From your personal opinion, is there brand identity in that K, or do you think there's opportunity for something a bit more nuanced or novel? Or do you think overclocking necessarily matters in the GPU space because often we deal with base and turbo and there's a lot of fluctuations within there?
Well, my personal opinion is overclocking definitely matters, even for GPU, and there's definitely interest there. It actually kind of goes hand in hand with the same systems that we overclock the processor on. So I can answer that one. Yeah. Regarding the K-SKU and using K for graphics naming, that's really more of a marketing call, but I don't think anyone would be upset if that was done.
and I guess to extend on the GPU front, we're seeing the HPC type GPUs from multiple vendors go from anywhere from say 250 all the way up to 500 plus watts. Are you involved in any way in that?
No.
Do you wish you were?
Yeah, I would love to be part of that as well.
I think we need to get on the phone to Raja.
I have plenty to do here with PC, CPU overclocking, platform overclocking.
So big scope, sort of holistic. Where's the next overclocking revolution going to come from? CPU, GPU, a specific feature? Perhaps on the system level, perhaps we have a completely redesigned motherboard that makes it better to overclock or better for thermal dissipation. You obviously have insight into several years in the future here.
Yeah,
just a little bit. But there's
a couple we could talk about. There's been a lot of technology development in the area of cooling and sub-ambient cooling, and you've seen Intel's cryo cooling technology, and that's really been kind of at the early stage. We're just trying to incubate something to see if you could actually cool the processor sub-ambient. What could you get out of it? So I think there may be an opportunity there, especially as efficiency improves. And that's technology hasn't changed a lot, but actually it's starting to change now. And so keep an eye out on that one. Sub-ambient cooled, that will really lift the overclocking capabilities, frequency Fmax. And then in the area of memory overclocking, there's a lot of opportunity there. You've already seen DDR5, but I mean, have you seen the headroom with DDR5 without any crazy cooling? You're talking about 4,800 mega transfers at kind of in spec with a couple of modules, where we're seeing 6,000 plus, like on the machine behind you here, that is very attainable by an average overclocker. You can just go buy it. So I think there's also user experience improvements. There's a big opportunity there. So how can we make overclocking easier for the user? So those are maybe 3 areas that I think right now are ripe for further exploration and development.
Internally, when it comes to memory frequency, are you saying megahertz or mega transfers? I notice you're being very explicit when speaking to me, at least.
I personally have always tried to use mega transfers.
Okay.
It's confusing for the consumer sometimes because some of the software tools still report in megahertz.
All the software tools
and
still say megahertz.
Yeah, and so we're trying to work that out, so make sure mega transfers is the proper terminology, explaining that double data rate, that's why you take megahertz, multiply it by 2.
And I guess on that front, do we need more memory channels in consumer, do you think?
I think consumers would love all the memory channels you could give them. Do they need it? Probably not. Maybe content creators tend to like more channels, and I definitely see that.
So what I'm hearing is Intel will re-enter the high-end desktop market. No comment.
I'll leave it at that. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan, for your time, and thank you for giving us a tour of your lab. They have blanketed a large section of it, because we're not allowed to see that bit, but liquid nitrogen, chillers, systems, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
If you like this content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We also have now a private Discord server, and if you want access to that, become a Patreon member and it'll instantly add you as long as your emails are linked. You can join the Patreon for as little as $1.50 a month, and it all goes back into helping the channel. Thank you for your support.